Okay, well, welcome to the 22nd meeting of 2013 of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. And members and the public should remember to switch off their mobile phones as they can affect the broadcasting system if left on. Angus MacDonald has sent his apologies and he's replaced by our substitute, Roderick Campbell. Welcome. I think Roderick's been here before, so there's no question of need for declarations and so on. Agenda item 1 is on the review of agricultural rents and the procedures in Scotland, and it's to take evidence from the chair of the Tenant Farming Forum, and I welcome Phil Thomas to the meeting, and I invite him, if he wishes, to make a short statement. Good morning, Phil.
Morning. Convener, I'll make it very short. I'd just like to say, I think, two things, one about me and one about the Tenant Farming Forum. Firstly, I should say that I am not a tenant farmer, and it has never been a tenant farmer. I have no land holdings at all other than the curtilage of my house, so I am in a genuine sense independent as the chairman of TFF. TFF itself was formed around about 2003 when the Agricultural Holdings Act was going through. Its primary purpose is to help promote a healthy farm tenanted sector in Scotland. And effectively, the way that it operates, it brings together key players, if I can describe it that way, across the sector. And it works on the basis of effectively taking discussion papers which are prepared by members or prepared by the TFF's legal advisors from the Scottish Law Society, or occasionally prepared by the chairman as straw man papers to start discussion. We focus around that discussion and then hopefully come to some sort of consensus which will lead either to a guidance paper or a policy paper or sometimes recommendations to government for change in legislation. At the moment we have partaken on what has been referred to as a route map process, wherein we have tried to address a whole range of things simultaneously or at least in parallel, against the concept that there will be a review of the whole area by Scottish Government, and this has been announced in 2014. And the things we have looked at particularly are rent reviews, which we're going to talk about today, arbitration, fixed equipment issues, diversification, investments, WAGO, and we've just started at the moment working on assignations and successions. So it really is quite a panoply of topics. As a consequence of that, the TFF meetings have moved from a situation where they used to occur quarterly to a situation where they're now occurring once per month, and there's a good deal of intensity behind what's being done. So that's the total background. I'm happy to talk about the rent reviews or indeed about any other topic if the committee wishes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start off with a discussion a bit about the relationship between the parties, because when we had a round table, we heard Angus McCall, the STFA, saying the situation in the ground is often a little more fractious and contentious than is publicly made out to be. Andrew Howard for SLE says it's not the case that there's a great sword of Damocles hanging over one of the parties but not the other. And Scott Walker of the NFUS saying virtually every tenant in Scotland would say that the balance of power is very much with the landlord rather than the tenant. Other remarks as well. With those things in mind, you know, what view does the TFF take of the relationship between landlords, their agents and tenants?
Well, I think you have to take into account first a fact that's often missed in this discussion, and that is that there is not a sort of clean break situation between tenants and landlords, or tenants and owners, perhaps I should say. In fact, there are many landowners who are also tenants, and there are occasions where there are landowners who are tenants who are also landlords in the sense they let out land to other people. So it's a slightly more complex platform of relationships than perhaps exists to first looking. I mean, there are, as in any relationship, first I should say that the relationship between tenants and landlords is actually a very important one. And this is a personal view, I'm not sure this is a TFF view, this would be a personal view. The position, as I see it, is most landlords have a business which involves renting land, and that in part is to reduce their exposure to the risk of farming that land. So what they're doing is reducing their risk by allowing somebody else to farm that land. On the other hand, tenants very often have that benefit that by having a tenanted land, they can buy their way into farming without the upfront capital cost of having to buy land. So it's a mutual relationship that benefits in some ways both sides. But in any relationship of that type, there are tensions and there are differences in perception. And now, unfortunately, in a way, I guess, I think the number of tenancies in Scotland is about 6,500 or 7,000. And of course, the tenancies and the issues that always cause the greatest amount of interest are the ones where there are problems. Through any rent review period, May or November period, there will be lots of rents, for example, that will be fixed, and lots of deals that will be done on the basis of discussion around a table and agreement pretty quickly. But there will be others where you will get tensions, and they're the ones that tend to come to light most often. The way forward in that, which is a TFF view, is for much greater transparency and a much more systematic approach to the whole process of setting rents. There is a feeling, I think, among some quarters that the setting of rent is a process that has a little bit of smoke and mirrors about it, because very often you're balancing up a whole range of different factors. And the more transparency you can put to that process, the better, I think. I don't know if that's answered the question, but that's the way that I would see it.
It starts to answer the question because you've obviously focused on trying to make the processes more transparent and more easy. But this is basically a 19th century problem, which is now manifesting itself in the 21st century, because I mean, one of the things which I think the government hoped was that we would see a situation where there would be more land being let to tenants over this period, and the statistics suggest the opposite, indeed over a long period. And the reasons for that, obviously, we want to go into. We know some of them. But it's the same when you say that people can become new entrants or can get into farming, buy into farming. The new entrants have not been helped in this either. So we're going to come to some questions about these things as we go through. But basically, there seems to me to be one view in the TFF about the relationship, which is that you try to sort the processes that exist. And on the other hand, there's a view out there that, in fact, nothing much changes.
Well, I'm not sure that the second view is entirely supportable on the evidence. And I put two things. Firstly, you're factually correct in the sense that the number of tenancies has gone down. Not hugely, but it has gone down. And that in part, again, is complex because you have had some consolidation of land. So you've had situations where the number of tenancies has gone down because holdings have by and large got bigger. And that's tucked away in the trends. There is an issue that is not a TFF issue really, but it's a political issue in the sense that you could take the view that on whatever basis that land ownership in Scotland is too concentrated, and that's a point that is politically made quite often. Land ownership is not too concentrated as a consequence of the Agricultural Holdings Acts. I mean, that's a position that goes back into history way beyond any Agricultural Holdings Act being introduced. As far as the new entrants are concerned, there is a challenge, and the challenge is that there's a limited amount of land available. There are some difficult barriers to new entrants coming in, and it's just getting access to land. TFF has campaigned with a degree of success, albeit limited, to get small holdings available to new entrants. And there have been one or two initiatives. The Forestry Commission, for example, recently have released some holdings on that basis. And the Crown Estate, I think, has become more sympathetic to the notion that they might have some small holdings that would allow people into agriculture. So there have been some changes there.
People wanting to follow that up in more detail. But Jim?
No, sorry,
Yeah, Roderick.
Yeah, I just, good morning, Mr. Thomas. I just wondered if you could perhaps just put a wee bit more flesh on this figure of some success with new entrants and small holdings. What are we talking about?
Oh, you're talking about handfuls?
Handfuls, yeah.
You're not talking about a huge movement at all, because
Yeah.
the reality is land turns over, if I can put it that way, relatively slowly. If you look at the amount of land that is traded into tenancies or indeed sold, it is relatively modest compared with the amount of land that's owned. So it's not a huge change there. And there is an argument that I think many of you were at the NFUS conference that was held maybe a week or 10 days ago, I think, just up the road here at the McDonald. And there were representatives there from the new entrant group of farmers. And effectively they were arguing that the present system in terms of the Agricultural Holdings Act and the like was too inflexible, that from a new entrant standpoint they would like more flexibility. That was the argument they were putting forward.
Alec Ferguson?
Thank you, Convener. I was indeed at that conference in the afternoon, and I was very struck by the two young farmers who spoke and were pleading for more flexibility within the system, because they had worked their way through that system very successfully. I was particularly taken with the fact that both of them contributed a degree of the success they'd achieved to the fact that they were able, both of them, to sit down face to face with their owners or landlords and actually plan a future for the holdings that they'd got. And I think that's something that we probably might want to bear in mind as these discussions go. But may I just briefly, Convener, touch on what I think is an elephant in the room here that we're all rather tiptoeing around. And it comes to the subject of the availability of land for rent. And let me say that nobody would like to see more land available for rent than I would in this room. It's a tragedy that it hasn't happened. But the elephant in the room is called the right to buy. And would you agree that as long as this spectre of an absolute right to buy continues to exist, landlords are going to, or landowners are going to look for every possible way to let land without tying themselves into the prospect of that land possibly being removed for them against their will?
Well, it certainly creates a risk element, if I can put it that way, that landowners are sensitive about. There's no doubt about that. And I think it's probably fair to say that the individual organisations around the TFF table, even the tenants' organisations, both NFUS, where there's quite a number of tenants, and the Scottish Tenant Farming Association, they are not supportive of the absolute right to buy. And that's on the basis that I think most people recognise that it might create a one-generation shift in land. But then you would have a situation where renting land would become more difficult because there'd be less land to rent. And I think that would be everybody's concern. It is an issue, there's no question about it. And I think despite the fact that politically it has been put on the back burner at least, it is still there. I am not sure whether that would explain all the issues of reduction in tenanted area, because you still have these issues, you know, by and large in a consolidated industry, a mature industry like agriculture, you have consolidation of businesses that get larger, and that means the land areas farmed by any one business have a tendency to move up anyway, and that reduces the availability of land.
Okay, for now, thank you.
I think I want to pursue this a little further, because I don't know if you saw the Bank of Scotland's annual review at the beginning of this year, which provided us with a sample of their customers, some 240, I think, out of 2,000. Many of us attended their presentation. And one of the questions they asked is, what is your attitude towards the following issues? And it was to do with the right to buy. And the interesting thing is that when you look at the figures provided, 70% of owner-occupiers strongly opposed any automatic right to buy, whereas increasingly a group of tenants, there was 53 who were strongly opposed, and that was mainly owner-occupiers. There were some tenants as well, but there was mainly tenants who were in favour of that right to buy. Now, isn't it interesting that people who already own their land are opposed, indeed, to others doing the same? Do you not think that's the impasse in this whole matter?
Well, I think it's a natural reaction, maybe, that those who own land wish to as they see it, preserve their interests, and those who don't own land equally would see it in their interest to own land. I think for any business, any farming business, the notion that you would own land, would be an objective. But the problem is, if you have a situation where there is no tenanted land, the barriers then to people getting into farming are huge, because you then have the problem of buying the land really upfront in the business. And that leaves you with very little investment to put into stock or anything else. So I think if you had a situation where all land was owned, the barriers to entry would be even greater.
So I mean, just before, some people want to come in on this quite rightly. I think it's quite useful at this early stage philosophically. If you look at what happened in Ireland, has any analysis been done of there? Has any analysis been done of how farmland changes hands in Denmark, where there's a limit to the amount of land that people can have? Ireland, where most tenants were turned into owner-occupiers by the Wyndham Act. All of this is in comparison to Scotland, where we're seeing there are fewer tenancies being let. New entrants find it very difficult in our system, but you're saying that in an owner-occupied system that you've got to spend a vast amount of money because of the cost of buying land. So we have a real impasse here.
Well, let me say first that taking the discussion slightly away from TFF into wider areas, and I'm happy enough about that, but anything I would say would clearly be an opinion from me. I couldn't say that it would be where TFF would stand on these things. In answer to the direct question, I'm not aware, certainly in my time associated with TFF, there's been no comparison of that type done. I am aware of the farming situation both in Denmark and particularly in Ireland. I happen to have spent 4 out of the last 5 weeks in Ireland on various different things. So Ireland is an area I know very well. And they are different in their particular ways from Scotland. In Ireland, there is now a significant problem, my opinion, significant problem of farm size. I think on the last set of figures that I saw published just a few weeks ago, something like 2/3 of Irish farms were not making any profit at all and were being sustained completely by the single farm payment. And single farm payment accounted on average for about 80% of the turnover across the farms. Now, many people would say that that is not a particularly healthy situation to have, and that's in part a consequence of the small farm size. So Ireland, I think, is a particular area. Denmark is slightly different, again, its own particular way, because the pattern in Denmark has been for many years, going a long way back, that cooperatives in farming have been really a major part of the whole farming scene. So to some extent, the pattern of farm viability in Denmark has been linked to a very active cooperative system and so on. So it is difficult to be absolutely sure that you're comparing like with like across different countries. That's where we sit.
Okay, that's interesting. To develop this a bit, first of all, Jim Hume.
Oh yes, thanks very much, convener, and good morning. Morning, Phil. Just exploring what you're talking there about potential of an absolute right to buy. I think you said in your view that would probably have a generation of benefiters, obviously tenants who were able to then purchase the land, but you'd be concerned, if I'm correct, that thereafter there wouldn't be land to get at a reasonable value, which is obviously tenancy. It would therefore be almost impossible, would it be, for someone to start from scratch as as you can with it when you get a tenancy?
It would certainly be very difficult. The cost of buying the land to allow you to get in first, I think would be an extremely high barrier. But in terms of the kind of pattern, one can only surmise what would happen. But it would be a reasonable point to take, I think, that if you had an absolute right to buy, a significant number of tenant farmers currently would buy, not all of them. Some of them would see the financial benefits of having a tenanted system, and if they're very happy about their tenancy, and there's a proportion who will be, they won't want to buy. But you would get a movement in that direction. Now, as soon as you get a movement in that direction, those who have bought the land are then not going to lease it out, because they will then be caught up with the same set of right to buy that allowed them to buy land in the first place, maybe. So I do think there would be a change in the pattern of land ownership, no question about that. But I think it would be a single generation change pretty well, and then you would have further barriers to entry. But that's a personal view. I mean, the other devices, this is a wider discussion, but the other devices that are discussed are devices such as limiting the scale of ownership you can have of land. That's a technique that has been used in some countries. The difficulty there is that whatever figure you take for the limit of ownership of land, you're always having to second guess the way that the business of farming develops. When I started to work in the agricultural sector, you could make really a very good living out of about 50 cows. There is not a 50-cow farm in the whole of the UK now that wouldn't struggle, frankly. Dairy farming, sorry, yeah. So, you have a situation where, because of the nature of the industry being consolidated, further consolidation is almost bound to take place in farming.
So, in effect, it would be quite difficult to see how a new entrant, if they can't get access to tenanted land, could actually start off if there was a good young graduate coming out of SRUC, perhaps, for example.
Well, it's always difficult, and if I'm wholly realistic with you, because it was a discussion I used to have with students on a very regular basis, I always used to say to them, for students coming out of faculties that are concerned with engineering, not everybody immediately assumes they will go and own a car factory. And therefore, I think we have particular expectations in agriculture that don't necessarily translate across all other industry sectors. But there is something quite fundamental and quite visceral, frankly, about a farmer owning their land or tenanting their land. The patch of land that you sit on and work on becomes really very important to a farmer. And that's constant, I think.
Thanks, Ingrid.
And Graham Day.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, Mr Thomas. After 2 years on this committee, I would still consider myself very much a layman on this subject. However, those 2 years have left me with a distinct feeling that this is an industry that talks the talk on new entrants and just refuses to walk the walk. And I wonder to what extent, if we're being honest, landowners use the spectre of right to buy as a convenient excuse not to rent land, because it is a pretty remote spectre of absolute right to buy, because even the tenanted sector isn't in favour of that.
Well, I really can only respond, I think, to that in an anecdotal sense. At the time that the 2003 Act was going through, I did a piece of research which involved me going around talking to a lot of landowners and tenant farmers. And I tell the anecdote very often, but there was one tenant farmer who was located just near the airport up near Inverness, who spent the first 20 minutes of the interview telling me what a rotten individual his landlord was, and spent the second 20 minutes of the interview telling me how he would never have got into farming if it hadn't been for his ability to strike a deal with his landlord and then build his farm up from that. And he had built up a pretty big farm by that time. So I think people's experience condition the way that they react to these things. In many instances, I think we have got into a difficulty with new entrants because there has been a pattern, for example, well, I would take the Crown Estate, but the Crown Estate would be typical of many big estates. There's been a pattern for many years of people saying a farm becomes vacant, rather than renting it as it stands, let's consolidate that to make a bigger unit which is more viable for somebody to run as a business. So in reality, we've gone down this pattern of less tenant opportunities becoming available. And you could argue, could quite rightly argue, that you might want to reverse that. The problem you have is that in doing that reverse engineering, pushing that back, you also have to realise that you might then end up with a lot of farms that are not really viable. So it's a difficult balance to put together, really.
Okay.
Right, well, we'll proceed on the path to try and establish what the TFF is doing. Jane Baxter, next.
Thanks, Convener. Morning, Mr Thomas. Just moving on to the process of the rent review, I'm wondering whether you've got any comments on if it works better when both the tenant and the landlord have professional representation, and do you think there's any need for tenants to get help with the cost of obtaining that advice?
Well, I'd have to say again that this is to some extent a personal view, not necessarily a TFF view. The factual situation is, if you look at the position across the industry, that most landlords use professional support. Many tenants don't. And tenants also complain, certainly this is a discussion in TFF that we've had, that there has to be some system that, to use the expression, has teeth in the rent review process. And we did have a discussion, quite a long discussion, which is, it's on the internet, so you can see the discussion in the minutes, where I effectively challenged those around the table and said, well, what you seem to be describing to me is a situation where it would be better for both sides to be represented by professionals, because then you do have teeth, because professional bodies have the appeals and disciplinary systems and so on in place. But there was a strong view that to move over to a completely professionalised assistance in rent review was in effect going a step too far, and that there was a need to maintain the situation where tenants or landlords could represent themselves, or could use a friend or a colleague or somebody who they had confidence in as being knowledgeable. Now, the difficulty with that is it's much more difficult then if you have that to put teeth into that system. So here I'm reflecting the view of the TFF. The TFF's view across the piece was that where professional advice was available, it was the choice of the tenant and or the landlord to choose to use it or not. Now, there are plenty of examples where tenants and landlords get together, over the table and agree a rent without any problem at all, without any professional help. There are other instances where the professionals on both sides, and the spectrum's completely between those two.
Thank you. Any further on that? The guidance on code of conduct then for rent reviews. Jim Hume?
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. A couple of points. Maybe you've maybe sort of went into it partly already, but just regarding the code of conduct for rent review, the annex to the clerk's notes from TFF stated that the completion date for the code of conduct is outside the TFF's control, which seems a bit odd.
I can explain that because that's a misunderstanding.
That's good.
The code of practice, code of conduct element is actually in its first draft note. So there's a complete practitioner's guide is the best way to describe it. There is a complete document which is now at its second draft stage, which will be published in September. Now the move then will be made both with RICS and with SAVA to take that document and embed it in their own professional standards as part of their professional standards. Now, the difficulty we have there is that that process will take time. RICS, for example, is an international organisation, so they will need to make a specific subclause, if I can put it that way, to deal with Scotland, because it won't necessarily apply elsewhere. And we're not in control of the timing of that process. What we've got is a willingness expressed by those professional organisations to move in the direction that we would like. We don't have the document yet that this would be based on, but that document will be published in September, and then we'll move on. So that's the explanation of the note that you have.
That's very useful, thanks. And just the further point from my question, I think you've already stated, and correct me if I'm wrong, to Jane Baxter in answer to her question, that the TFF don't believe that those who are conducting rent reviews professionally should be registered or etc., or be professionally registered in some way. So just make sure that that's correct. But
well, again, let me make it absolutely clear. The TFF position has been that it should be a matter of choice. They are not against anybody using professional representation, but the view is that professional representation should not be mandatory.
That's fine. That's quite clear. Therefore, in your view, how would compliance with a voluntary code be monitored and or enforced?
Well, those who are using professional guidance are straightforward, because if you have a situation where somebody's doing something that's contrary to the code, you could go to the professional body concerned, and the usual professional body mechanisms would fall in. I think there's a difficulty, frankly, in relation to those who are not professionally qualified, and I can tell you where the discussion has got to on that. My concern would be that twofold. Firstly, that somebody could be advising, you know, a colleague or another farmer or whatever, and not realise that potentially they could put themselves in a position of liability. So I had a concern from that direction. The view from TFF was that was TFF members was that was unlikely to be an issue, and the mechanism I think that will emerge, and this is something we will have to try to discuss with the Land Court in due course, but certainly it was the TFF view, was that if a case of dispute arose in a situation where the advice was not being given by a professionally registered person, and that case went to the Land Court, then it would be then up to the Land Court to ask the question whether or not the Code of Good Practice guidelines had been contravened in any way. And therefore it would affect the resolution of any dispute that would come forward. That was the sort of policing mechanism. That's not necessarily, you know, that isn't written down and scripted in a way that you can put it step by step. It actually leaves an element of interpretation open there. But there is this difficulty that most people feel that the decision whether or not to be professionally represented must be down to the individual who's concerned. So either landlord or tenant, if they don't want to be professionally represented, the feeling around the TFF table was they should have that choice.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Thanks.
And I think then dispute resolution a bit further on this.
Yes, well, it very neatly brings us on to the subject of dispute resolution, which I wanted to just explore a little bit further. We're all very aware that, and have been made very aware that in the event of a dispute going to the Land Court, it can end up in a very lengthy and indeed extremely expensive business for whichever side, particularly whichever side might lose. The Rent Review Group was proposing, I think, a sort of case management procedure should be looked at, and I wonder if you could perhaps, just to start off on this subject, whether you could just expand on how that's being taken forward and progressed.
Well, there's 2 points, 3 points maybe I should make. One is that during this month, during July, the TFF will publish a guidance paper on resolution of disputes. During this month, SAVA will launch its arbitration system. That will be in June. That system will be launched. So that will be a short route arbitration system which should help to resolve some disputes. So those two things, I think, are both positive stages. In terms of the case management arrangements, that's become increasingly interesting, because not just in relation to rents, but in relation to a number of other issues. The discussion of the TFF has ended up at a point of saying, well, of course, if there was a dispute, you'd take this to the Land Court, and then somebody saying, well, of course, you'll go down the route then that would become very expensive. And the view that is emerging is it would be helpful if the Land Court, within its terms of reference, could find a way effectively of facilitating solutions, if I can put it that way. Now, we had an initial discussion, an initial meeting with the Land Court, where the Land Court made it very clear that they would be willing to be as helpful as they could within the terms in which they can operate. And those terms are fairly clearly laid down and by and large are legal terms. And the intention that I have is that very shortly, and this will be over the next few weeks, I will have a list of things that have come out of all these discussions, which will all fall into this box of saying, could the Land Court be helpful? I would then like to go to the Land Court and say, these are the things that have come out. Can you see out of this list which things you can actually be helpful on? And in most cases, I think, for example, if I could take a specific point, there are some cases where there might be a relatively minor dispute over fixing a rent, which might come down, in effect, to the value of the rent being one direction or the other. Now, in those instances, it would be probably extremely helpful if the Land Court could say, rather than taking this as a long case through the Land Court, why don't you go to arbitration? And there's a short-form arbitration system available. So that's the sort of solution that I think may well come out of this. And there are some other issues, for example, if I took the diversification one, there are some tensions in diversification where, for example, somebody wants to do something as a tenant which may have a conflict with what the landlord is wanting to do. And there is a feeling by some tenants that in those circumstances, landlords delay the approval by asking continuous questions, so they draw the process out. From the landlord's side, I have to say that the vision often is that they ask the question, but they only get a partial answer, and it's not enough for them to take a decision on. Now, there is a legal resolution to that, that the parties can go to the Land Court. Relatively few ever do, because they're concerned about the ultimate cost. And the cost, I should add, is not the Land Court itself, it's the cost of all the legal support the individuals choose to have in going to the Land Court. But in those instances, again, it would be helpful if the Land Court could facilitate the process by saying, well, that stance is unreasonable, you know, and this stance would be one that, if it came to the Land Court, we might consider has a good case, if I can put it that way.
So that's a sort of work in progress with some results hopefully coming in the fairly near future.
That's a work in progress that I would hope by the end of the summer, I would hope we've got, it would be optimistic to think we'll resolve all the issues, but if we could get some of them resolved, I think that would be real progress.
Well, thank you for that. You also mentioned the word arbitration, and I just wonder if we could maybe touch on that a little bit, because the Rent Review Group, I think I'm right in saying, also recommended sort of alternative dispute resolution procedures by looking at a system of arbitration and expert determination. And I just wondered if you might be able to expand on where that's going a little bit.
The arbitration system that the Rent Review Group referred to, as I say, will be launched in June. My information on that, which I think from memory was that the last time was on the 14th, I think it was, of June. The launch will take place this month, and I think there was a dialogue going on. My guess would be probably with the Cabinet Secretary's office to see whether there's an appropriate event, as it were, that this could be put alongside. So that bit is moving forward. In terms of developing that arbitration, the SAVA, when they looked at it, their legal experts told them it was best to do the process, arbitration and expert advice, in two stages. So having got the arbitration system agreed and up and going, the expert advice system will follow on immediately afterwards, effectively on the same model, if I can put it that way. And I would think that, again, would be, well, I'm guessing, but it would be September or October. It will be within this year that will be there.
I'll just round off this with one short question, Kavita, if I may. When we took evidence from the Rent Review Group, they, I think if I remember rightly, they more or less sort of finished up their evidence by saying that they felt that a lot of their recommendations would, I think the term they used was sort of remove the fear factor that currently exists in some cases during the rent review process. And that if they could remove that fear factor, you would actually remove the grounds for an awful lot of dispute. And therefore, if you could do that, you would presumably prevent a lot of these things having to go through any form of arbitration. I mean, is that something that the TFF would broadly agree with?
I think most people on the TFF table would agree with that. Certainly, I thought they made their case very well. The areas where you get into differences of view, and this will now come out as part of the practitioner's guide. There is always a debate when a rent is fixed about the degree to which the rent should reflect market rates for rent at that time, and the degree to which it should reflect the financial productivity of the farm at that time. And I suppose the extreme positions in this would be that some people would say you should ignore market values and simply look at what the farm is actually doing at that moment. And other people would say, but actually that creates a situation where if somebody is not running a productive business, you're having to, in effect, carry their inefficiency within a landowning business, and therefore you should move in the other direction. In truth, there has to be some sort of balance, logically. And I think what the Practitioner's Guide will do is it will tease out the detail of that balance in a much more effective way, and hopefully make it so transparent that everybody can see exactly what's being taken into account at any stage. That won't mean that there'll never be a dispute, but I think there will be less.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Roderick Campbell.
I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points of your evidence, Mr. Thomas, but perhaps I should refer to my register of interest as a member of the Faculty of Advocates. Just in relation to discussions with the Land Court, the thrust of Lord Gill's review of civil justice in Scotland at the moment forms part of the Making Justice work programme of the government. One of the underlying principles is to reduce, where possible, the number of court hearings, and certainly the number of hearings where oral evidence is required. It might be something that you should take on board in discussions with the Land Court as to what could be done to reduce the number of oral hearings and to simplify that procedure. And just in relation to arbitration, arbitration comes in many forms. Arbitration is not necessarily cheaper than a full court hearing. What you need to do is to develop forms of arbitration which take on board the need to keep the expense of the process under review. Otherwise, quite often, not necessarily in this area, but often find that the costs of arbitration are just as expensive as a formal court hearing.
I would agree with that, and that's one of the arguments for what's referred to as expert determination, the point that was made earlier. In many cases, rather than going through an arbitration process, I think the two sides, the parties concerned, will opt for saying, well, if we're in slight disagreement, let's just simply get an expert in to look at it and just give us a view, and we will stick to that. So I see both those things operating, and in many cases, to be frank, the differences between landlord and tenant may not be all that great. You find people sometimes become in dispute over relatively small amounts of money. And the danger that you have is once people adopt a particular position, then you start to go down this land court route, which can be very long and as a consequence, very expensive.
Okay, move on to about the process of setting rents. Richard Lyle.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Thomas. A few moments ago, you actually used the phrase smoke and mirrors to set the tone for the question I'm going to ask you. Basically, the way rents have been set have been described as being in some ways a dark art. Witnesses that this committee's heard have expressed the wish that the process be more transparent, explainable, understandable. There's been particular issues in regard to short, limited duration tenancies, how to account for the fact that some rents may be higher because farmers are prepared to pay more rent, as you said, to consolidate their holdings for land that's adjacent to land that they already farm, how the scarcity of lets already has been covered. So, having said that, can I ask you how the way rents are being set, how can they be more transparent, understandable, and what would the TFF do to help that process so we wouldn't have the dark art or the smoke and mirrors?
Yes, I should make absolutely clear that the dark art or the smoke and mirror terminology wasn't an opinion that came from me, in the sense that I was simply reporting that some people have that opinion. Equivalently, if you had members of the profession around the table here, they would explain to you in great detail that these things are done with great care and taking all account of every factor. The reality is, of course, that unless that process is absolutely transparent, then there's always the possibility that somebody will feel that it doesn't reflect what they see as the truth of the situation. So the whole of the practitioner's guide process is designed to tease out how you would weight one factor as against another, what the process would depend on. And there's been a lot of discussion and debate, really, because one of the I can't remember which finding it was, but one of the findings that came from the Land Court tried to set out, in effect, a list of things that needed to be taken into account. And that put market value at the top of the list. And I think it was the listing was intended to be helpful. In reality, it probably wasn't, in the sense it appeared to move the market value into a pole position in terms of the determination. And I think you would find that some tenants at the moment would argue that the rent reviews that are currently going on have been affected by that suggestion, and market values being put up front. And that's a view that you would get from some tenants. You would equivalently find many landowners who would point out to you particular cases where that very clearly isn't happening. So there is a debate there. And I think the practitioner's guide is going to have to set out in quite specific terms that all these things have to be taken into account, but they are a matter of balance. Now, I'm not quite sure at this stage, because the draft is being prepared, I'm not quite sure how they're going to articulate the way that you balance one against the other. But that needs to be done. And some of these things are difficult to judge. They are professional judgments. Because if there's, for example, a marriage value on pieces of land coming together where a farmer has a holding and he's wanting to bring the holding next to him into conjunction with that to make one single business, there obviously are advantages in doing that. And therefore, in a market sense, that will push the rent up. So all these things, I think, need to be fairly carefully balanced. And this document, hopefully, will do exactly that.
Thanks for that.
And moving on in the same area, Claudia Beamish.
Good morning, Mr. Thomas. I think probably there'll be other members who want to ask questions about this aspect that Mr. Lyles started on. Could I ask you specifically about the setting of rents in the English system, just to get some clarification on that, and whether any elements of the approach should be adopted in Scotland? And there was discussion previously about whether the rents were higher or lower in Scotland, and I know that the Scottish Tenant Farmers Association has done research to show that, in their view, that they are higher, but there are other views on that as well. So could you make any comments from the Tenant Farmers Forum Association, perspective?
The document, if you like, the guidance document, which has been in place in England now for a number of years, lists the factors that need to be taken into account, but it deliberately points out that these have no particular pecking order, if I can put it that way. It simply says that they all need to be taken into account. We haven't had a guidance document in Scotland, so it's really been left open to the profession and to landlords and tenants to find their way through that. And I think having a document in place that articulates in some detail what's required, I think will be helpful. On the question of the relative rents north and south of the border, it's a very difficult comparison to make because you're never comparing like with like, and that's part of the problem. There have been pieces of work that have been shown or have claimed at least that rents in England are slightly lower. There are other pieces of work that have claimed that there really is no difference. Frankly, I couldn't give you a definitive view on that. I think it's a very, very difficult thing to judge because of this issue of comparing like with like. And my guess would be that if you took, I don't know, an area like Cumbria, for example, and compared it with Cheshire, you would find that there were very big differences there as well. So within England, there will be differences that will be significant.
Could I just pursue that, the broader issues further? To go back to before the question about comparing England and Scotland, I think if I'm right that you highlighted that it's a balance between all the different factors that have to be taken into account. But I'm somewhat concerned to hear at this stage you saying that you're not quite sure how that's going to come out. Surely that would have come out from a recommendation from the Tenant Farmers Forum. And if we look at the sort of to broaden it out even further, if we look at what the Scottish Tenant Farmers Association is saying, I think there's been some disappointment expressed that the rent review group, working group, has missed an opportunity by not carrying out enough research into this. And I appreciate funding issues are always a question for all of us in whatever we're doing, but is some of the research perhaps a bit too anecdotal to base the future on? You're talking about the balance doesn't seem to be sorted yet.
Let me take the two questions I think that are in there. The first is, can I spell out exactly how that's going to work? Well, the answer is no, because the development of the document has been put to the professional group that are doing it. And they will produce that document, which will then have to be approved through TFF, and there will be discussion on the detail that will tease that out. That element is something, the document will be there, the process will be there, but if you're saying to me, do I know what the outcome of the process will be, I couldn't give you that answer at this stage because it's not at that point. I think in relation to the research, the difficulty is that there are genuine difficulties. This is not an easy research area because almost every single farm tenancy will have its own particular characteristics. And in a market situation, if I can put it that way, what people are prepared to pay for a tenancy will vary with their own particular business. It's no different from, renting a flat in the centre of Edinburgh. There are some people who would see the location being more important than other people and will be prepared to pay more for it. And the same is true within a business context if you're talking about renting farms, for example. So it's not an easy thing to research. The one point that I could add in there that might be helpful to you is that there has been a lot of debate, again coming out of the rent review group, about the notion of having a listing of rents. At the moment what happens is that a number of different organisations, both the professional bodies and indeed people like the NFU and the Scottish Tenant Farmers Association, they have their own little databases that they use. And the rent review group came up with the idea that if we could get a voluntary national database, then that would be extremely helpful. The reality is everybody around the TFF table agreed that that would be a good idea. And then you actually got into the practical difficulties of doing it. And it becomes very difficult because if it enters a database that has anything to do with government, in effect, you start to run into data protection issues, and some of those are almost insuperable. If you have a situation where one of the organisations took charge of it and did it for everybody, there then are elements of distrust, if I can put it that way, coming from others. If you then say, well, let's have an entirely independent body to do it, you run into the difficulty simply of cost, because it's a relatively small batch of data, and therefore the cost of dealing with it is relatively high compared with the data that you have. Now, the one bit that's emerged, the two pieces that have emerged more recently, we got to the stage where we'd more or less said, it's a great idea, but we can't see a way of moving forward with it. Two things have happened within the last month. One is there was a review, a survey of NFUS members, and quite a high proportion of members came out with the notion that they would be very much in favour of this. So there's very strong support for it on the ground. And I think that survey would have included both landlords and tenants, which is helpful. And the second thing is we've suddenly discovered or suddenly realised that the land and buildings transfer taxation legislation is coming through, and that will require a registration of rents of some type. So it may well be that some of that information is going to become available purely out of another process. So we're going back to relook at that.
Convener, I understand there will be further questions about that aspect, but could I just take Mr. Thomas briefly back to the issue of the rents themselves rather than the register? Do you see that there's any concern in relation to the decision made in the Moonsey case in relation to rents? And I know there's been a suggestion by the STFA that it could be a possible consideration, although we always want to avoid further legislation where we can, but that the amendment of Section 13 of the Agricultural Holdings Act 1991 could allow a proper account to be taken of productive capacity and earning potential, and that this, in the present circumstances, is something that, if it came towards an issue of the Land Court, that it would be possible that there would be those involved would have to pull back. I wonder if you've got comment on that from the tenant-farmer forum perspective.
In a factual sense, I'd make the point that where you have the extremes of view is you would have some people who would argue it should be total based on productivity, and some people who would argue maybe it should be total based on land value. The Rent Review Group took the view that the legislation didn't need changing, that the legislation is okay, but what you needed was this practitioner's guide. The problem that you have, frankly, within all this is the productivity of individual farms of very similar character, whether it be in beef or in dairying or whatever, can be enormous. So you can get a very wide spread of incomes, as it were, from an individual farm, partly reflecting the way the business is being run, and in some cases reflecting the business model, if I can put it that way, that's being pursued. And therefore you get into these almost philosophical debates about if you have somebody who is running a lifestyle business, if I can describe it that way, on the one hand, should the landlord be penalised for the tenant's decision to do that? So that's one part of the argument. On the other side, you have the argument that says if you have somebody that is in a has a very productive business, should they be disadvantaged because their productive business creates the opportunity for them to pay more rent? And therefore, that would actually work against the tenant in that direction. So it's not an easy thing to come down to a very simplistic, at least in my view, it's not an easy thing to come down to a simplistic statement that would say, this is the way to do it. I think you do need to take into account the balance of the two.
I think everyone on the committee, and as I'm certainly a lay person as well, as what Mr. Day said, but everyone is trying, like yourselves, to look for a fair way forward, and in a sense, you know, the more open and transparent it can be, the possible, and the extremes aren't necessarily the things that of a lifestyle tenant or aren't necessarily the things that have to find where, you know, they have to be considered, but they have to be, you know, we have to look at where the heart of the situation is, I think.
Well, I'm taking the extreme for illustration.
Yeah.
I mean, the vast majority of businesses are sitting somewhere in the middle, by definition. And that's why I think you need to have as much transparency as possible. But to adopt one extreme or the other, and there would be people in farming, you know, on both sides of that debate. You know, there would be some people who would argue that you simply should do a farm business appraisal and costing, and that's what the figure comes out at. And quite clearly, that would mean you would never have a business that would fail, in inverted commas, or at least rarely.
But clearly the statistics show that the bigger part of the income of farmers comes from the subsidies the public purse provides. So surely there's a different onus on farming with regard to this than a private business that's a newsagents or a cleaners or whatever. You know, there's a very different circumstance about you know, transparency that you talked about at the beginning.
Well, again, these arguments, you know, become slightly philosophical, but let me tease out the issues there. I think if you start from a public policy standpoint, which would be the place I'd start from, you firstly start having to consider in public policy terms things like food supply, environmental management, all the usual things that go in there. And then you come down to a decision and discussion about whether or not, or the degree to which the land system you have in place meets those requirements. And that always puts you in a position where you're left considering land use. Land use is absolutely crucial. It's, in any country, land use, you know, is the central core. But then you come down to the next stage, because you can get the same objectives of land use from very different business models in the way that you operate your farms. So whilst the land use bit is very much a public policy, how you implement that, I think, is you know, much more in debate. And then you inevitably then get down to the point of saying, well, is there a social and community element to this? And again, that's a political decision, and I couldn't possibly take political decisions, really.
Okay, well that leads us suitably, since Mr. Day's question's been answered, to the wider work of the TFF. Rod Campbell.
Yes, morning again, Mr. Thomas. As I understand it, the TFF is engaged in looking at other related areas of agricultural holdings law other than purely rent review matters, but perhaps you could give us some indication as to what you are involved in and what liaison or discussions you're having with the Scottish Government on that.
Well, the areas we've been looking at, and in some cases still are looking at, are fixed equipment issues, diversification issues, and we will have a paper out in July on diversification. I think we've got with diversification to the point that we can encapsulate all the views, and there will be a guidance paper published in July on that. Investment issues and WAGO issues, which relate to investment issues in part. And then finally, we've just started to discuss assignations and successions. And that is an area where there is an element of debate about whether the present law is right. And without getting bogged down in detail, that there are differences with different types of tenancies, and part of the argument is, should all the tenancies be the same? There's a piece of debate that comes out of the fact that the 1964, I think, from memory, succession law is presently coming up for consideration and revision. You will know more about that than I do. So there's an element there that's coming out of that. And there's an element that actually comes out of the kind of discussions that were taking place at the NFU conference the other day. And these are sort of discussions about whether, if somebody is making an assignation, whether there should be more flexibility in the way that can be done, and whether or not you could create that flexibility by changing the type of lease arrangements that there are in there. Now, we haven't got far enough with that discussion for me to give you chapter and verse on that, but all those elements are being discussed as they were in the NFU meeting.
It's a varied portfolio. Just in relation to the one where obviously you're most advanced in diversification issues, could you just give us a very brief kind of précis of what you think this report will be saying in July?
I can. The paper on guidance, effectively, will essentially point out the areas of conflict, potentially. It will then come through into dealing with conflict conflict resolution, if I can describe it that way, how you move past these things. So it's what the tenant should do, what the landlord should do, what you do in cases where there are conflict, and then it brings in the specific legal opportunities there are if there's a conflict that can't be resolved. And these both come back to the land court, but the opportunities are there. So there's quite a lot of detail because there are some differences, for example, depending on whether diversifications involve woodland or whether they involve particular types of buildings. There's some advice in there, for example, in relation to developing businesses that are based on diversification further into the food sector, which is something that often causes an issue. So that's how the paper is put together. And it's in the third draft, I think, from memory. And it's out for final comments, and that will go out in July.
Jim Hume?
Just a small one, just to... yes, thanks. Just regarding WAGO and perhaps tenants and improvements has been brought up before at this committee, maybe a little while ago, but regarding forestry planting, of course, Scotland's tenanted sectors are a large area. It's very difficult at the moment, I believe, for tenants to actually plant trees because they would then be the owner owned, and correct me if I'm wrong, by the landlord, but of course you could also look at it as a tenant's improvement. Of course it takes about 37 years for a commercial tree to be worth it, to be felled, if you like, and of course you can't expect always a tenant to last that long to see in the tenancy to see the fruits of his labour, but of course a 20-year planting has a value. Has the TFF looked at this situation at all, or would perhaps may?
Yeah, the WAGO stuff we're still working on, so it's not finalised. But you're quite right, there are some quite tricky issues, of which forestry is one. There's also an issue that is tucked away there, which... well, let me spell out what the issue is, and then perhaps I can come back to what you would do about it. The argument is put that if a tenant is wanting, for example, to put up a new building for whatever they're doing, and the landlord is not supporting that building, sometimes what happens now, as I understand it, is the tenant simply goes ahead and does it. And tenants have, or some tenants, have the view that if they've done it, then when it comes to WAGO, they should simply get compensated. And there is a kind of difficult issue there in relation to the Commission of Human Rights, Convention of Human Rights stuff, because really it's very difficult to have a situation where you take a decision on something that I then have to be responsible for. So it gets you legally into quite a difficult situation. And what we've been trying to do is to see the degree to which it might be possible to tease these things out in a way that would allow the right kind of progression. And it very often comes down to the fact of there being a judgment on whether the buildings that are available on the farm are suitable for what the farmer wants to do. And that's where you get into these areas like expert opinion coming in to resolve disputes. You know, because the farmer may be saying, or the tenant may be saying, well, I've got a building, but the building is just not suitable for modern farming, and therefore I need to put up a different building. And when you get into those kind of areas of dispute, then somebody coming in as an expert would actually help to resolve that, we think. But that's the kind of issue.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I think that's right.
And Graham Day, who I forgot earlier, asked. And then Nigel.
Thank you, Convener. Easily done. Can I just get some absolute clarity on the diversification paper that you referred to? Will that include specific guidance on the appropriate levels of adjustment to rent agreements that should be made?
Not as it's written at the moment. I think the position in legal terms, in terms of the Act, is that a diversification does not necessarily lead to a reduction in rent. So, for example, if a piece of land is being taken out of operation for some diversified activity, it doesn't mean that the rent will come down because you've got less land. The size of the holding is the same. In terms of rent increases, I think you get into this situation where you're looking at the whole of the balance of activity, but it's still being valued as an agricultural holding. Now, what happens now occasionally, or perhaps more than occasionally, is that if somebody is making a diversification which really is not part of the farming activity but is something really quite outside, you find the tenant and the landlord agreeing to take that diversification and the land area related to that and take it out of the agricultural lease and deal with it on a commercial lease basis. So that sort of arrangement sometimes is already taking place, as I understand it. So it is a mixture. There are no, there are no numbers in the paper. There's a reference in the paper to the legal position and what landlords and tenants need to discuss. But there's nothing that says if it's a farm shop diversification, there is certain adjustment.
But with respect, shouldn't there be some sort of guidance included in that? Because we had a stakeholder session earlier on in this process at which there was a good common sense consensus around the table of what was and wasn't appropriate. And yet you still hear stories out there in the field, forgive the expression, where landlords are looking for inappropriate levels of increased income in return for permitting diversification. So isn't there really a role for the TFF here to provide some guidance?
Well, certainly the guidance, all the guidance, always takes a standpoint that if you're going to have a long-term relationship, it must be based on appropriate and reasonable interpretation of what's going on. I couldn't say that there weren't cases out there where what you're describing has taken place. I personally don't know of any, but in the range of activities that are going on, it's almost guaranteed. And equivalently, I suspect there'll be cases in the other direction where a landlord has been relatively generous, if I can put it that way, in terms of the rent, because it's in everybody's interest for farms to be viable. So if a farm is not viable as it is, and the diversification is going to make it viable, the landlord will be as interested in that as the tenant will be, frankly. It is difficult to, on a point-by-point basis, deal with every case. And that's where you get into these areas where, to some degree, it's an advantage, frankly, I think, to have professionals involved on both sides, because you then can get down to the nitty-gritty of the debate about how the final agreement will be set up financially and all the rest of it. But it is a very wide spectrum of, if you think of the number of diversifications on farms and the range, they are now enormous.
Presumably the TFF could offer some broad guidance on the do's and don'ts.
Well,
best practice.
Yes, the document that has been produced effectively is a best practice guideline. It sets out a step-by-step way that you would approach this. It identifies potential points of conflict, and then actually goes down the road and also brings in things like taking account of planning laws and all the rest of it, including things like food businesses which operate under a different set of regulations. And then it actually sets out what you do in a situation where there is a disagreement that leads to a legal dispute and what the options are. I think the most difficult one that I could imagine when we were trying to write this, which is very difficult to allow for and may in reality only occur very infrequently, but it did seem to me that you might get a situation where very often a landlord is farming, or at least an estate has a particular area of which there will be tenant farmers. And you get into a very difficult area if the landlord and the tenant both have a good idea, and it's the same good idea for diversification at the same time. Now, I'm not very clear in my mind how you resolve that. You resolve it through discussion, but it's a very difficult one to resolve. And that must happen occasionally.
Thank you.
Nigel Dunn, please. Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr. Thomas. I'm just wondering whether I could pick your brain from the experience that you've obviously had over a number of years of dealing with this whole area. If I can just go slightly off script and just ask you, There are a large number of organisations, I still feel as though I'm the new boy on this committee, there are a large number of organisations with which you have to deal, representing all the groups in the industries. Could you possibly reflect on whether there are too many organisations, too few organisations, perhaps whether it's difficult to deal with government organisations or otherwise? I'm not trying to... I'm not going anywhere in particular on this, but I'm just wondering whether you could reflect on the huge number of different people and organisations that you have to work with and how well that works.
Well, you always remember the occasions where these things work very well, and equivalent, you always remember the occasions where they don't. For the vast majority of the time, you're somewhere between those two, I guess. In relation to the number of organisations, I think it's pretty fundamental that any group, be it an industry group or indeed any group of any sort, who feels they have a particular need to come together to be represented as a group, must have the democratic right to do that. And that sometimes leads to more organisations than perhaps logically you would say are necessary. So to say the situation is ideal would be wrong, maybe. But it's very difficult, frankly, to force a whole group of people to simply come into one organisation and take a particular set of views. It really doesn't work like that in the real world. In terms of government organisations, I'll get onto a hobby horse that you've heard me talk about before, wearing other hats. I do think we have a problem generally across Scotland in a whole series of fields of relatively over-regulation. No, you know, you can argue the whys and wherefores in any particular set of circumstances, but we do have a lot of regulation. And we do have a problem in some areas which I have to kind of lay at the door of Parliament, frankly, because Parliament makes laws, and then occasionally you find that there's a particular law which you really can only find out what it really means by testing it through the courts. And that always leads to these situations where, you know, for a number of years in some cases, something might go on where it's not entirely clear what the real impact of the law is. It's very difficult to avoid that, I think, but that's the reality.
Claudia Beamish.
Could I ask you, please, either from the perspective of the Tenant Farmers Forum, if it has a position, or else for any other comments you have on the concerns of tenants with short, limited duration tenancies and limited ones of that kind in the aftermath of the Salverson Riddle case, and whether you see any place for compensation in that area?
Well, I couldn't comment on the legal situation because I'm not qualified to do so, but I would be very surprised if the case doesn't have some impact. As I understand it, and you could well be better informed than I am on this, but as I understand it, the Scottish Government has currently got internally some group looking at this and trying to work out just what the implications might be. But there were potentially an unknown number of people who were affected in some way or another. And I suppose it really comes down to finding out whether or not those people would have a case for compensation. But I think that's an example, for instance, of what I was saying a minute or two ago about things going on a long time. Because that was something that came through Parliament as a decision, and it's taken, well, effectively 10 years, really, for that to be bottomed out in terms of knowing what it actually means in legal terms. So there will be implications, but I couldn't really guess how large they would be.
Do you not think that, you know, we've seen a period where the work of the Tenant Farming Forum has led to the government making changes by secondary legislation, indeed by the Agricultural Holdings Act recently, to try and plug the gaps, to try and make it more clear about the relationships. Do you not think that we might be expecting from you some suggestion about other legislative activity, or indeed how to avoid legislative activity Yeah.
Well, I think the answer is yes. I mean, since I've been in the chair, we've been involved with 2 pieces of legislation that have gone through Parliament. And in each of those instances, they have been relatively specific, because the view has been within the TFF, let's identify where the problem is, and then let's look to fix that particular problem. Now, I think coming out of the process we're going through now, which is, as I indicated earlier, we've scaled up the activity very substantially. I think you can probably anticipate that there will be a view, as indeed to some extent has come through already in some parts, that says don't change the law, because by changing the law you might just make the thing worse. In other cases, there may be a situation where there are specific recommendations. As I mentioned, for example, in relation to the assignations and successions, which we've just started discussing, I have genuinely no view on what might come out of that. But what I have been struck with is that there is a willingness on both sides to have the debate. And if out of that debate we get to a point where we can see that by making some sort of change in the present arrangements, that the situation could be improved, I think both sides will go along with that.
I mean, looking at this, in the round, there are 2 parts to where we're at here. Many of these issues you talk about, fixed equipment, diversification, investment, WAGO, assignation and succession, they all precede the 2003 Act, at the point where the TFF was set up.
Well,
so there have been long-running issues in farming.
Let me take an example. Fixed equipment, I think, is an interesting one. And I'm not apportioning blame here in any way, and it's certainly, certainly nothing to do with me, if I can describe it that way. But the view that is coming through at TFF is one of the major problems in that area is that farmers, tenants, landlords are not keeping proper registers of fixed equipment condition. And if we could get the whole of the industry to move to a situation where those condition registers were being kept, it would remove just an enormous amount of the tension over fixed equipment, because you'd have a situation where everybody would have a clear idea, at any 5-year period, as it were, everybody would have a clear idea of exactly what the situation was. It would overcome a lot of the debates about whether a piece of equipment is in the condition it's in simply because it's worn out or because it's not been maintained properly, and so on and so forth. So there are things, I think, that can be done that do not involve legislation, but would make us step the industry forward a long way, frankly.
So that's things which you've taken on board, but you were prodded into a speedier approach by the Cabinet Secretary to speed up the process, and you've responded by saying you've moved to monthly meetings and so on. That's all welcome, and indeed that we're expecting some outcomes in the autumn. However, there's still the dichotomy between, sorting out the sticking points that would reach some sort of stability, which seems to take forever, and whether indeed the argument is that the system actually needs to be much more streamlined. I wouldn't say simplified, because I think that would be not the approach that necessarily made it easier, and that the Tenant Farming Forum isn't the body for actually dealing with streamlining the system.
That's an interesting philosophical question, because essentially it poses the issue of whether the stakeholders in any given activity are the right people to ask about how that activity should be conducted. Now, I wouldn't be so bold, frankly, as to take the view that they weren't, because I think my experience would be that if you don't ask and involve the stakeholders, you're really getting very often into some very deep and difficult water. It is probably true that, and I can't answer for the longer term, I mean, my involvement in TFF has been really over the last 2.5 or 3 years. I think for a long time TFF was trying to struggle with some really quite large and intractable issues that were, well, some of them came out of the 2003 Act and some of them were predated that by a long way. My intention, my hope in the process that we're going through now is that certainly as far as I'm concerned, I'll work myself out of a job within relatively few months on the basis that we will have agreed positions on everything that is needed and recommendations where there is thought to be any need for changes in legislation. Now that process, at least as I see it, should feed into the 2014 wider review. And I think in that sense the TFF has a role to put into that review the stakeholder view, if I can put it that way. I think that's one of the functions that it will take. I think if you say, well, can we tear things up and start with a blank sheet of paper, I would be very reluctant to suggest that that's a position you want to go to. Some of these things are really quite complicated.
Indeed they are. Graham Day and then Alec Ferguson.
Just a point, Kabir. Of course it's appropriate to consult with the stakeholders, but in return for that you surely require that the stakeholders find a way and have an ability to compromise. And isn't the TFF perhaps held back by this need to find a consensus rather than agree a majority view and proceed on that basis?
Well, the interpretation I've taken, and you know, I've not necessarily done this. The TFF was set out to find consensus. I've taken the view that in areas where we find consensus, then that's just terrific. If there are areas where there are polarised but very clear views, then we should simply state that there is no consensus and there are differences in view. In reality, I think in almost all the circumstances that we've come across, I find people are much closer together than they might think they are, you know, at the first looking at a problem, if I can put it that way. Because at the end of the day, the landlord-tenant relationship is a relationship that benefits both sides. And unless it benefits both sides, it won't work, really.
And Alec Ferguson.
Yeah, really, just to continue that, I mean, I would also add, I think that there is an additional partner in that equation, and that is the land itself, which you mentioned land use is very important. And if we can get this dealt with, then the land is actually probably the biggest beneficiary of all, if I might suggest that. But I mean, the Land Reform Review Group came under some criticism for having left the subject of agricultural tenancies and holdings to one side, and I personally thought that was the right thing for it to do, because my own view is that it's actually worth going the extra mile to try to achieve consensus through a body that was set up to try to do that, because I think if there is a possibility of all sides agreeing, then everybody wins. Are you aware of any, given the sort of fairly short timescale that you're now talking about before coming to final conclusions on most of these, are there any areas of your work that you can identify now in which you can say for certainty that consensus will not be reached? Or are you fairly positive that consensus can be reached?
Well, the area that I thought would be, whether there would be the greatest tensions, was the area of assignations and successions, which we left to the end of the list to start on, because I felt we had to try to build consensus within the group before we got to that. We had our first meeting on that on the 10th, I think, of June, and I was actually quite surprised that there is a lot more common ground perhaps around the table than even the practice of the different views had envisaged. So I am reasonably optimistic that we will get a position of general agreement on pretty well everything that we've done. The Land Reform Review Group I should comment on. I make this simply as a factual comment so that you're clear. The Tenant Farming Forum agreed with a consensus right across the piece that I should write to the Land Reform Review Group suggesting that they didn't move into the area of agricultural holdings, because that was something that the TFF was dealing with. And I think very helpfully they came to the decision that they weren't going to do that. There then has been quite a bit of debate which essentially has been a disappointment by one of the TFF members, that the Land Reform Group didn't look at tenanting more generally. I have read into that this wasn't a specific comment on agricultural holdings. This was a much more general comment about land ownership, some of the things that the convener was referring to previously. Now, those things, I have to say, are not things, you know, what level of land ownership is the correct level of land ownership. That's not something that's on the TFF agenda. I mean, that's not what the TFF is all about. So that's where I think the comment about the Land Reform Review Group came from. And of course, there have been one or two comments from Jim Hunter in particular, I think, in the press about right to buy, which Jim has strong views about.
Indeed.
But it would be the case that if tenants wish to have a discussion then about the right to buy and about land ownership in general, that they would have to expect the Land Reform Review Group to assess these matters. Because what you've been talking about have been a whole list of things that have been long-standing issues in the way that tenant and landlord relationships exist at the present time and have done for many decades and have been amended and become. So therefore, you know, the tenant farmers are obviously frustrated by that process.
Well, let me put it very clearly. I mean, the remit of the Tenant Farming Forum is to promote a healthy farm tenanted sector in Scotland. That's what its purpose is. The TFF is not an organisation that was set up to look at land reform in that wider sense, nor indeed would it necessarily be the right group to do that, because you're moving into a political area which really is not an area that TFF would be in. And there will be views, I suspect there will be views around the TFF table on land reform at that political level, but that's not a part of the TFF remit. The TFF remit is very specifically looking at a healthy tenanted sector in Scotland.
So if that's the case, then finally, going back to my very earliest questions, you know, about new entrants in farming, has the TFF concluded its views about how to take forward the issue of getting more tenants onto the land at this stage?
Well, it did a piece of research before I joined the TFF. It did a piece of research on new entrants. It has engaged either directly as TFF or through TFF member organisations, if I can put it that way, with a number of initiatives. One has worked through the NFU, working with the Crown Estate. One has worked with the Forestry Commission. So there have been a number of specific issues like that. I think we will come back to the issue of new entrants time and time and time again, because it will remain an issue. And the challenging thing about it is that to allow new entrants in, you have to have a higher level of turnover in terms of people retiring out of the industry, because the vast majority of farmland, as distinct from estate land, if I can put it that way, the vast majority of farmland is actually farmed by owner-occupiers. Now, those owner-occupiers, if you take the average ages of the industry, are now approaching what would in any other industry be a normal retirement age. For a whole variety of reasons, people tend to retire late in agriculture. They may well sit on the land and contract the land out in terms of it being farmed under contract, so they may not actively be involved personally in agriculture. And the tricky bit, the challenge would be to see if within that sector there is a way that you can introduce that would encourage, allow those particular farmers, those owners, to release that land for tenanting rather than contracting out or whatever. And that is a challenge.
Well, you said that this issue would come back time and again. And at the previous stage, you said you'd hope to do yourself out of a job by coming up with a reasonable set of proposals. You know, that means that the prospect is that there's going to be a tenant farming forum hugely into the future, long into the future.
I think you will always have a situation where the groups of people who sit around the Tenant Farming Forum table will want to get together to discuss common issues. And one of those common issues will be the issue of new entrants. Because it doesn't matter whether you're a tenant or whether you're a landowner, everybody recognises that the difficulties, the challenges to people getting into the industry will remain, and they're not easy to solve. But the reality is that the way that you solve that is to get a greater turnover of people who are currently farming. You know, releasing land that's currently being farmed by somebody else. And that's something, and there may be not a single solution to that, it may be a variety of solutions. But for example, when you have single farm payment there as a major part of income, where you have a farmer who is sitting in a house that he's lived in for most of his life, that he may not want to move from, where he can farm the land without actually physically engaging himself in farming, then those elements are bound to come in. And you'll get people with very varied views. I mean, one of the views, for example, that I heard at the NFU conference was somebody at the table I was at said, well, if you had a situation where the single farm payment was age limited, then that would solve the problem. Well, it would on the one hand, but I wouldn't like necessarily to be the person who took the decision to do that. So there will be different views about this.
Yeah. The major view that hasn't been taken into account is that if there's more land in hand, in landowners' hands, that could be turned into new entrants units, that it's not a question always of having to take the land from somebody who's already farming.
I'm not sure I'm fully interpreting your statement there.
Well, there's people who are farming the land as tenants or as owner-occupiers in a particular area, but there are also larger landholders, landowners, who may well be farming land in hand. Therefore, it's possible that they could provide the route for new entrants, and we've not got round to that discussion yet. I mean, do you agree that that's an area that needs to be looked at?
Well, I think you have to be very careful with the figures. That's my first point about there. One of the difficulties is that many large estates have large acreages, but a good proportion of those acreages may not be particularly good farmland.
But land that is farmable, you know, estates that perhaps in the past had several tenants, but now have only one or two. You know, this is an area where we haven't really explored, and where the people coming to the plate from the landowning interest are not yet actually necessarily helping the new entrants by making more land available, because although they may own large areas of land, they don't necessarily have all their income coming from that land. Small estates are probably different, we have a situation where we know in shooting estates that most of the income comes from subsidy by somebody having another job and looking after it. But surely there must be land of that sort that's got to be made available, or at least assessed for availability.
Well, I mean, those are political decisions that really, in a sense, are well outside the TFF. But there are a number of points I think would need to be taken into account. Not all large farmers own all their land by any means. I mean, you can have some quite large tenants, frankly, in there as well. Many estates do have quite progressive policies in terms of leasing and so on. So it's not a simple, one-size-fits-all picture on it there, I think.
Trying to add to the picture, of an area that we've not addressed just now. Quite frankly, the frustration that's expressed by people about this issue, which is, you say, is going to come back time and again, has to be addressed in the widest sense. That's why I raised it with you just now. So I'm just wondering whether, in fact, it's something that we could see some answers from the TFF, in this review period.
Well, the TFF certainly would be encouraging landowners to look favourably on being able to release tenancies, because that's part of the new entrant thing. But the TFF has deliberately not taken, in talking about a healthy tenanted sector, the TFF has not deliberately not taken a view of saying, and that means there will be X number of farms. The reason for that is you then get locked into that issue of small farms, small tenanted farms versus larger tenanted farms, and the viability of one versus the other, and so on and so forth. And I think there is for me, there is a distinction. The policy issue you have to decide on first is land use. Once you've decided, once as a government or as a nation we have decided on land use, you then come down to, in effect, the national business model about how you achieve that. And that's an issue for political discussion. That's not where the TFF is focusing its attention, I have to say.
You made these points very clear, so thank you for that. Okay. There are the sandwich of a couple of farmers and a couple of other members who want to ask questions just now. Very briefly, please, and brief answers. So Alec Ferguson first.
Well, I'm no longer a farmer convener, sadly, you may think. But I gave up farming in 1999. Yeah, very briefly, I mean, in other forums, I've been made very aware that a number of people have gone into farming and have found a way into farming over the last decade. And their biggest issue is not access to farming, it's getting access and entitlement to the support system, the SFP that you mentioned. And I was, as I said at the beginning, particularly impressed by the young man who spoke at the conference the other day. He had found his way into farming, he'd worked his way up. And really the question I wanted to ask is whether the TFF has any idea of the actual scale of this problem. I mean, how many people are... do you have any idea of how big an issue this is, the whole thing of new entrants?
Well, we have had some interaction with the new entrants group, and we have, to be frank, tried to encourage them to engage a bit more with TFF. The reality is that they're all young guys who are driving their businesses forward, and frankly, are not wishing to be too involved in the politics. As far as they're concerned, as you've said already, I think if they could get equal access to everybody else to the support systems, and single farm payment in particular, what they're looking for is a level playing field. And it was very apparent from the statement that were made at the NFU conference that they feel that if they've got a level playing field, they don't want or indeed need any kind of special provisions, that they will find their way in the world provided they're on a level playing field. And I thought that was quite an interesting reaction that came from them. In terms of the numbers, I couldn't give you numbers off the top of my head, certainly, about the prospective, the number of people who would come into farming. And in many cases, of course, you do have people coming into farming who are children of existing farmers who are going back to the home farm, and they are kind of hidden in the system because they don't appear as the farmer. They are simply included in the farm staff. And again, the transition there in agriculture often takes place quite late in the day. Lots of farmers are quite reluctant to hand over to their son, in my view, rather too late, if you see what I mean. They should maybe be stepping back a bit earlier, but that's a personal view.
Could I just at this point and ask if you can, from the TFF, identify any numbers to answer Alec Ferguson's questions? That would be very helpful, in writing to guide us. Claudia Beamish, followed by Jim Hume.
Thank you, Convener. It's just to very briefly go back to Graham Day's point about consensus, because of concerns that I've observed, which may or may not be correct. But and I hope you take these remarks in a helpful way in which they're meant, because looking to the past, I've noticed that, at least in one instance, there's been a group which is part of the Tenant Farmers Forum which has continued to have concerns about which they've been vocal after a consensus, which is, I think, defined as a feeling of, if not togetherness, of agreement, has been reached. And so it seems like certain things haven't actually been resolved in the way that my definition or understanding of consensus would be. And I wonder the point to which you said, I think, that if there were cases where there wasn't a consensus, that would be made clear if there was a group or whatever that would be identified as not being part of that consensus. I wonder, in terms of the future, how helpful it would be if that did actually happen. There may be instances where it's happened in the past, but I think it might help the process further if that was the case. And I hope you don't mind me raising that.
And I'll comment on the specific issues. As always is the case, agriculture is a political, small p political, and sometimes a big P political business. Agri-politics is very often quite complex, as some of your colleagues around the table will tell you. And in the TFF, we have a situation where we have a number of organisations who are member organisations. Now, we can get a consensus around the TFF table, which can be at an organisational level. That doesn't necessarily mean that members of that organisation will necessarily all align with whatever consensus has been reached. What I've tried to do, and there was a particular issue in relation to the Rent Review Group, was at each stage to be very clear with people and say, this is what we're agreeing to. Do we have an agreement on that? In the case of the Rent Review Group was accepted by the TFF. Again, if you refer back to the minutes, you'll find it there. I think in communicating to the Cabinet Secretary after the Rent Review Group, I was very careful to say the Rent Review Group has been accepted, and therefore the report has been accepted. There is an issue in relation to a difference of view about, well, the very thing I was talking about earlier, about the degree to which you would set a rent based on the productivity of the farm as against the market value of the land. But in reality, that process was being dealt with out of one of the measures that the Rent Review Group had recommended. So that's where we ended up. Now, it may well be that at the end of the day, when we get to the guidelines being there and so on, that we will have a situation where one or more of the member organisations might say, well, I don't actually agree with that. And if that's the case, then we'll have to deal with that at the time.
Right. And Jim Hume?
Yes, thanks. It was just really following up the point regarding in-hand farming, so-called estates, who would maybe traditionally have leased out the land, actually taking it in hand. I know in my own area it's happened to quite some extent. But I just wonder on your views on why that is the case. Is it perhaps the case, as I've heard rhetorically, of course, that's because there is a fear of absolute right to buy coming in. Therefore, if you keep it in hand, there's no tenant can actually risk that, and that, of course, has an effect on new entrants. But also, of course, while we're in the middle of cap reform, many landlords and, of course, tenants as well shall be withholding any changes in their businesses until cap has actually been reformed.
Well, these are personal views, not TFF views, I have to say. I think both the things you've identified there have come into play. I think undoubtedly there will be some landowners who will be concerned about absolute right to buy, despite the fact it's been said that this has been parked, at least for the time being. But there will be a concern. The CAP thing also is a concern, because if you look at the agricultural industry as it exists at the moment, we have various parts of the industry where, in effect, the industry and the market are not working together because farmers are holding back on decision-making. If you took the beef sector, for instance, which I have an interest in, again, not a personal interest, but an academic interest, I can put it that way, we have a situation where beef prices are high, processors are in difficulty because they can't get supplies to meet the market, and yet the production or the number of stock on farms is actually going down currently. And that, in part, I believe, is everybody sitting on their hands waiting for these other decisions to be made before they can take their own business decisions. So it is it's not a simple situation, it's quite complex. But certainly right to buy will affect some people, affect their views, and CAP will have a big impact too.
Final question from Graham Day.
Thank you, Kabir. And I want to take this back to the TFF's role in encouraging new entrants. Going back 18 months ago, Scottish Land and Estates were looking at providing starter units. My understanding of this is they made only limited progress in that regard because of the identification of an issue with creating churn further down the line, so that there was somewhere for those who'd access starter units to move on to, so we could bring people into the starter units. Now, if we accept that the starter unit approach is the right way to go, surely that's where the TFF comes in. And having had the door opened for new entrants, the TFF, some of the ideas you talked about earlier, flesh those out and deliver on those. So I guess my question really is the TFF as a body working sufficiently well in unison on this hugely important issue?
Well, I guess ultimately that's a judgment for others to make, in the sense that the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. What TFF certainly has done within the scale that it operates, it has worked, for example, through the members, actually, not necessarily through TFF directly, but for instance, SLE did come up with some starter units and has got a commitment to look for more. NFUS have started a scheme, got funding for a scheme effectively of mentoring, where new entrants they have a point of contact, if I can put it that way, who can advise them on the best way to get into farming and so on and so forth. So there are a number of separate initiatives that have been taking place. But I don't think you will solve the new entrant issue overnight until you get more movement out of farming of existing, now in many cases quite mature, if I can put it that way, farmers. That's the bit where you need to get the churn, really.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sure that Phil Thomas has been used to extremely long sessions in the TFF over these years, and particularly in the last period where there have been monthly meetings. And I'd like to thank him for an extended session just now, for the evidence which helps us in our appraisal of these things and our questioning of the Cabinet Secretary. So thank you very much. We will take a short break, a comfort break for a couple of minutes, and get on with agenda item 2. So thank you. We return to agenda item 2, and this is to hear from Jane Baxter, who will give a report on the Infrastructure Capital Investment Committee's inquiry on community transport, and refer members to the paper and ask Jane to speak to the paper without reading it all out.
Okay. Thank you, Convener. Although I could speak at length on this topic, but I won't do that today. Just to say that in approaching this task, I was mindful that my remit was to reflect sort of rural issues and rural perspectives into the inquiry that was taking place. And so my report confirms the sort of points that I made to the convener tomorrow, just to say that, and to confirm what I think we'd all agree is that community transport plays a really important role in rural communities, as does other forms of transport. And although it is mainly older people and people with disabilities who use it, there is a challenge about how we support people in rural communities and how they access health facilities and indeed education and leisure. So it isn't just a health issue or an old people's issue, it's a community issue. And the convener had no difficulty with taking that on board. It's my view that there's a scope, from my experience in the past, I've formed the view that there's scope for increased coordination and partnership working at local level with local authorities and health boards, and that can best be organised and coordinated at local level. And I'm aware of many examples of where IT has been used very creatively and effectively to support that. But none of these things will happen by magic. None of these things will happen if they're just left to evolve. I do really think there's scope for some leadership either at local government level or community planning level or the Scottish Government level. There's a role for leadership and a bit of strategic direction, and I hope this inquiry is used as an opportunity to provide that direction. Claudia reminded me this morning that Age Scotland had been campaigning for CT operators to have access to the concession affairs budget, and whilst that's true and that campaign is ongoing, I didn't reflect it in my report because we didn't have a view on it, and I wasn't sure what our view would be on that, so I didn't feel that I had a remit to comment on that specifically, but it probably comes into the category of the paragraph where I'm saying that third sector operators would look for available funding. That would include those sorts of funding. I'm happy for us to specify that campaign if you want to. The reason I didn't is because we hadn't really discussed it. Thank you.
Comments from members. Jim Hume?
That point I was going to make up. I've been around, thanks to Age Scotland, to many community transport projects in South Scotland, and the fact that often community transport is in places where there isn't any public transport, or the public transport is not available, and of course that therefore more rural people who rely on community transport, elderly people of course, don't have any help regarding concessionary fares. So I would welcome it as specified in the report, but of course or at least for people to look at it. I know the Minister has responded in the past regarding it, but obviously nothing.
I disagree. I didn't include it because we'd never discussed
absolutely,
it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And also we're in a position that there'll be a report from the committee itself that's the main committee on this. So we will be able to review that at that stage. With that in mind, any other questions?
Well, I would just endorse that. I'm sure all of us that have rural constituencies and discuss things with our community transport people are very aware of this call, and I've got some sympathy with it. I fully appreciate there are major cost consequences of that. So, but I'm hoping it will come out in the overall report and can therefore be discussed in full Parliament.
So it would be useful for us to actually perhaps have a session with the overall report from our point of view, so that we can make some points, both in debate and to help the process forward.
Just to say, Convener, I'm not actually currently serving as a substitute in the Health and Sport Committee, and so I was there on the day that they took evidence about this inquiry, and it was very, very interesting to hear the range of opinions and views in the room. It was a useful session, and it's... Sorry.
Can I ask you, when is the report due to be published?
It says June. I don't know.
End of next week, I believe.
Okay.
So it would give us an opportunity to discuss this either informally or whatever, to try and make it.
I think that'd be really useful.
A follow up, because there will be a first, some kind of debate. So it would be useful if we could have an informed part.
We would clearly need to look at that and convene relatively early in next year's work programme.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, I also understand the issues about the health spending that there should be in this, which I think might well be part of the thinking of the 2020 vision for the NHS that it contributes. So that might be another source of funding that is being contemplated.
The biggest risk to community transport, I think, is that it sees itself only in one box. It's got to be able to operate on a number of different fronts and be flexible, and that's the route to sustainability.
Well, we have to thank Jane for that report, because I think it's clearly part of our job in rural affairs, and I believe that we've got an opportunity to take it forward once we see the report, and I thank you very much for that. Our next meeting will be tomorrow, the 20th of June. The committee have an evidence session with the European Environment Commissioner, Seamus Potocnik. And the following week, on June the 26th, will be the last meeting before the summer recess. We will take evidence on land reform from the review group's chair, Dr. Alison Elliott, agree a draft report on the regulatory reform bill if required, and discuss the committee's future work programme. So we look forward to these things, and I close the meeting in public and move into private right now.